In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Christ is risen. Christos Voskrese. This will be the last Sunday that we say that officially. But I sing it to my grandchildren every time I see them. So you can still say it. But we don't say it in church after the leave-taking of Pascha, which is Wednesday, because this coming Thursday is Ascension. So say Christ is risen all you want, but not in church after that. I say it every day. I sing it every day. And if you want to, go ahead. St. Seraphim did. So that's a good enough endorsement for me. There's three things that are really powerful in this story. It's really an exciting story. People make Hollywood movies and they think they're exciting, but that's just make-believe. This is real. This really happened. This is the transformation of a man's body and soul. And it's really exciting to see how he transforms, how he becomes enlightened. Not only to be able to see physical light, but be able to see the light of God. So this is a story of enlightenment. And it's gradual. Your enlightenment is gradual too. It goes slowly. Too slowly for us, huh? Way more slowly than we want it to go. But that's the way it is. Enlightenment happens as we respond to the grace of God. And if we respond to the grace of God appropriately, then God brings us more enlightenment. It's really not correct necessarily to say He brings us more grace. God is everywhere. His grace is His energy, His light that He gives to us. It's just that we cannot understand His grace, appropriate His grace, be benefited by His grace, except as changes occur in our life. Little changes in us, and then big changes. And there were little changes that happened to this blind man, and then big changes over the course of the interrogation by the Pharisees. But just remember that your enlightenment too is something you should be pursuing. You're not just living life, doing whatever. You're trying to become a whole person and to become an enlightened person, to become a person full of God in your deep heart, so that you will have the likeness of God within you. And this is happening in a process. And it happens in reaction to what you do. And we'll see that in the blind man very clearly. Also, it's kind of a principle. Some of you guys have noticed it, I'm sure. Especially people who have been baptized and they come to me and say, it's so wonderful. And then a couple weeks later, or a month or 2 months later, they tell me about some temptation that occurred. With good things come temptations. Don't be afraid of it. It's just the way of the world. It's not the way of heaven. It's not the way of God. It's the way of the world. With good things come temptations. Don't be afraid. If you pray and you have this, let's say, moment with God, well, expect a temptation later today. If some good thing happens to you in life, expect a temptation. Don't be afraid of it. Don't literally kind of be obsessed and sort of obsessive compulsive about it. Like, now that a good thing happens, a bad thing's going to be happening. I know I got to go hide. Don't do that. Just expect that with good things come bad things as well. Because the devil hates when we reach out to God. He hates it. So he fights against us in ways big and small. Don't be afraid of this. And that brings me to the third point that I want to bring forth in this gospel today. Courage. You can't do anything without courage. If you're not courageous, pray for courage directly. Oh Lord, help me to be courageous. Because to not be courageous is a sin. Now, to be afraid is not necessarily a sin. Because courage is to do what you should do, regardless of the circumstances, whether you're afraid or not afraid, that you do what's right. And this blind man had opportunities, and he probably was afraid. His parents were afraid, and you can see a vast difference between the way he reacted and the way his parents reacted. His parents had zero courage, zero reward. And he had courage. And so he had a great reward. So just remember, be courageous. Don't be afraid. Our Lord owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He knows everything about us. And everything that he does is for our benefit. Don't be afraid when temptations come. Now, they're hard. Sometimes they're really terrible. Sometimes we have a lot of troubles. But don't be afraid, because God's going to help you through all of it. Never forget that. And never forget that your enlightenment is coming slowly. And it's coming in reaction to how you react to the grace of God. So let's look at this life of this blind man. Really exciting. It's right in line with everything else that's been preached about and read in the Gospels on Sunday, this period of time. Because the Gospel of John really was the gospel that was used after neophytes, when they were baptized. Then they were taught with the Gospel of John more fully. And the Gospel of John just reveals such grace and such enlightenment and so much about Jesus Christ. And the particular selections that we read, such as about the myrrh-bearing women, and actually that was not John on Sunday, but that was from Mark. But the Sunday Gospels, most of them are John, and about the blind men and the Samaritan woman, about Thomas. Those Gospels, they are about gradual enlightenment, among other things. But certainly a major theme is how we react to God, and God brings forth more knowledge of himself to us. And then as we have more knowledge, we have more ability to react to him. But we also have temptations. So we must be courageous. So that's all the things together. Enlightenment happening to you, and your reactions are contingent upon, the enlightenment is contingent upon your reaction to God. And with good things, you can expect temptations. And you must be courageous throughout all of it. Let's see how the blind man did this. So he was a man that was born blind. In fact, he was born without eyes. We know this from our services. We know this from our church tradition. When the Lord spat on the ground, he made balls of clay, and he stuck them in the orbits of his eyes, which were empty. He had no eyeballs. So he looked a mess, and he had mud dripping on his face and everything, and he told him to walk in the pool of Siloam. And most likely people were kind of jeering at him. Maybe a kid was tripping him, things like that. But he came back and he was seen. So part of the reason why they said he looks like him, but he's like him, but we're not sure, is because now this was a man with eyes. No longer just holes in his eye sockets. But it was clearly him. He said, "I'm him." People didn't want to believe it. Especially the Pharisees didn't want to believe it, because the Pharisees wanted to have their elite way of living. And Jesus Christ wasn't like them. And the people liked that. The people loved Jesus more than the Pharisees. They were afraid of the Pharisees, but they loved Jesus. And so the Pharisees were trying to crush Jesus and have control on him, so they come up with any excuse. Can you imagine to say that it's breaking the Sabbath to do good? That means you don't understand the entire Bible. Not a word of it. If you think that it's a sin to do good on the Sabbath day. Father Nicholas just gave a story yesterday about doing good even when going to a feast day. Some of you heard it. I won't repeat it now. But it's a beautiful story. Of course it's godly to do good on the Sabbath day. Of course it is. The blind man is brought before the Pharisees. First of all, there's just some people that ask him, how were your eyes open? He said, the man that is called Jesus made clay, he anointed my eyes. And he said to me, go to the pool of Siloam. I anointed my eyes, and I washed, and I received sight. Pretty simple. That's just the facts as they happen. And then they say, where is he? He didn't know. He didn't know what Jesus looked like. He'd never seen him before. And so they brought him to the Pharisees. They brought him to the Pharisees because the Pharisees had heard about this hubbub, and they wanted to try to crush it. So here is a man who's healed and is really a contradiction to their way of life, because they want to have this rigid adherence to man-made laws, because God didn't make a law that you can't heal on the Sabbath. Man made that law so that they could have control. So they bring the blind man to them. Most likely this blind man knew very little about theology and such, because he was probably not in the synagogue, because people said, well, he's a sinner. So he was a neophyte. He knew very little, but he learned really fast. Really fast. He was obviously very bright, and I don't mean just bright with his brain. He was bright with his soul, because he had such courage and such ability to adapt. So the Pharisees ask him how he received his sight. And see, he says, he put clay on mine eyes, and I washed, and now I see. And then the Pharisees say, this man's not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Now this is sort of the first nudge from God to the blind man. Obviously he's from God, because the man sees. And yet the Pharisees say he's not of God. Why would they be saying that? They'd be saying that because they were wicked. And so this is starting to percolate in this man's soul. He doesn't quite understand it yet. He's standing before them being interrogated because he can see. What an amazing thing. What they should have done, and they should have said, glory be to God that you can see. Come join us, brother, in the reading of the law. But instead, they were interrogating him. He was in trouble because he was healed. So he is kind of this is coming into his soul, and he doesn't know what to do with it yet. But he's standing before them. And so, they say to him again, what do you say of him, that he opened your eyes? Now, the blind man puts a little bit two and two together. Well, only a man of God could heal somebody. The Pharisees say that he's not a man of God. So I think the blind man had a little bit of a sense of humor. A little bit, he's giving him the needle a little bit. So he said he's a prophet. Has to be a prophet. A holy man of God and a prophet. And so that, I'm sure the blind man knew that saying that was really going to get under their skin. But see, he was starting to learn. He was adapting. He was reacting to the grace that God had given him. That was a courageous thing to say. He could have said, I don't know. He already said, I don't know where he is, because he didn't. He didn't know what he looked like. He could have said, I don't know. I see. It's just, I don't know how it happened. But instead he said he is a prophet. That took a lot of courage. And also it took, to be honest with you, just being a bit of a rascal to say that. Don't you think? He was standing before these people that had authority, and he was telling them exactly what they didn't want to hear. I'd like to shake that man's hand. I think that's awesome. I think we should do that more often. And we should say what's true no matter who's standing in front of us. It's the way it should be. So he says he's a prophet. The Jews didn't believe him, so they called the parents. They're looking for some excuse. So they asked the parents, and the parents say, well, yeah, he's our son. He was born blind, but we don't really know. You ask him. They passed the buck. The parents, they failed their examination. They failed that test. They could have said, we have a son who was born blind. He was begging. In fact, we as parents, we didn't love him enough. We actually let him be on the streets begging. God forgive us that we did this, but now our son sees, and now we see too. They didn't do any of that. Instead, they said, our son's of age, you ask him. So that's another piece that the son sees. Sometimes we can see by negative things, they draw us to the truth. Because we can see the blind man saw that the Pharisees were obviously jealous and saying sinful things about a man who clearly had healed him. And then the parents were afraid to confront the Pharisees and the ruling elite of the synagogue. And so, then they call him again, the Pharisees call him again, and say, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. Well, already the man was very clear. He knew that he wasn't a sinner, for sure, because a sinner is not going to heal somebody. The man knew that. So he says, whether he be a sinner or not, I know not. he's really just kind of speaking ironically. He knows he's not a sinner. But one thing I know, whereas I was blind and now I see, then they say to him again, what did he do to thee? How opened he thine eyes? And he said, I told you already. Can you imagine speaking before these big shots, and he's just giving him some lip, really? This is exciting. I think this is wonderful. Because he's been led to this, because as they have confronted him, he has been courageous. He's still standing there and taking it. In fact, he's given it back. And that's exciting to see. See, his soul is opening. What's happening to him is not just that his eyes have been made for him and he can see, but his soul is opening to the light. Because as he's confronted with various things, he has an opportunity to back down, to kind of grovel a little bit, and so he can be accepted into the company of the cool people. But he's not doing that. So he says, I told you already, and you did not hear? Can you imagine how they clenched their jaws when he said that? I want to be there for that. I want to be a fly on the wall to see that, huh? How angry they must have been, how red they were in the face. I told you already, and you did not hear? And the regular people, just the rabble, the crowd, they must have been going, you go. Tell the truth now. So I've told you already and you did not hear. Would you like to hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? He knew they didn't want to be his disciples. I do not recommend always that you're rude to authority, but in this case, it's pretty awesome, isn't it? It really is. He's really being rude to them in shall we say, a godly way, because he's exposing their hypocrisy. And then they reviled him and said, thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke unto Moses, as for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. Now, he could have backed down then. I mean, yeah, he'd been rude to them and he kind of pricked at them a little bit. But he could have backed down and says, you're right, forgive me. All would have been forgiven. They would have won. They would have stepped on his neck, shall we say. But he didn't do that. He said, why, herein is a marvelous thing, for you know not whence he is, and yet he's opened my eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, and if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, it was not heard that any man opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. That took a lot of courage to say. He knew that he would be expelled for saying that. They had been threatening him, and he had opportunities to back down, but now, no chance. Because he stood up to the authority and spoke the truth. And because of that, God enlightened him, because he's kicked out of the synagogue, which means he can't come back. He's considered to be a sinner. They're not going to let him come into the synagogue. He's being shunned. And the Lord goes and finds him. Now, he hadn't seen the Lord. He didn't know what the Lord looked like. So he says, dost thou believe in the Son of God? And he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe in him? And Jesus said unto him, thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. That's not really the right term. He gave obeisance to him. The King James says worshipped him, but it's actually he gave obeisance. He bowed down to him. Of course he was worshiping him, but it was a different word. This is a beautiful story, and this has to be your story, because we're blind men too, aren't we? There's things that we don't see. Sometimes we don't even have eyes to see. Sometimes our eyes are cloudy. But God enlightens us. But he expects something with that enlightenment. He expects that we give him our heart. And if we give him our heart, there are people who don't want to give their heart to God. They're going to be angry with us, and stuff is going to happen. And we'll be ostracized, or we'll be put out, or we'll be punished. There might come a time in our lifetimes, I think it will happen, where some of us will be in jail for being Christians or other things. With good things, sometimes bad things occur. Not because God brings the bad upon us, but because the world is toxic and the world is dying. But we are not dying, we're living. And we're becoming more and more alive every single day, every moment. Just like this blind man. He started to be able to see, but he couldn't see spiritually yet. Didn't even know the one who had given him sight and given him eyes. But as there were temptations that came upon him, and he reacted to them with courage and even with just with real strength. I think he might have been an Irishman the way he talked, to be honest with you. He just was a little impish the way he talked. I just loved the way he answered these people. And when he did that, God filled him with more grace, or made him more aware of the grace. And then his heart is opened and the light of God is shining forth, and now his heart can see. And when Jesus Christ then presents himself to him, he's had all that preparatory work, and he believed in Jesus Christ. It's a beautiful story. It's a really exciting story. I hope you're excited by it. I hope you read it many times this year. I hope you read it at least 4 or 5 times this year. I hope you've already read it a couple times so far this Paschal season, because I'm asking everybody to read the Gospel of John straight through and then read it again, and then read it again, and read it again. This is a beautiful, powerful story, and it is our story too, if we make it our story. So just remember, enlightenment happens slowly, but it happens because of our reaction to the grace of God that God gives us. And with enlightenment comes temptations. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be afraid of temptations. And certainly don't be afraid of those who tempt you. They don't have any strength. They don't have any power, whether they're with bodies or without, whether they're men or whether they're demons. Don't be afraid, because God is going to bring you through everything, just like he brought the blind man through everything. This is the key to salvation. Seek enlightenment and react to the grace of God by changing. Don't just be a bump on a log. You have to change. This is a necessity to change as the grace of God comes to you. And be courageous, and don't be afraid when there are temptations, because they're all going to go away eventually. There'll be a day when we have no temptations. Now that'll be a day probably in the next age, the 8th day, the unwaning day. No temptations, no sadness, no darkness, no interrogations, no fear, just God, just peace in the heart. That's worth fighting for, and that's worth enduring a few temptations. Christ is risen. God bless you.